Hey, what's up everyone out there? My name is Jakejames Lugo and welcome to my channel. So as a cool follow-up to my Blood Omen review from a little while back, I wanted to talk about the game's sequel. Usually whenever people are talking about the Legacy of Kain, they're usually referring to not only the PlayStation games, but one in particular, and that's the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. So is Soul Reaver still a good game to play on the original PlayStation, or is it something that's really archaic and hasn't aged all too well? There's a lot to unpack here, so let's just dive right into this. The Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver was released in 1999 for the original PlayStation and Windows PC, but the game also made its way onto the Sega Dreamcast in 2000. However, when most people discuss this game, they're usually referring to the PlayStation version. Soul Reaver is the sequel to Blood Omen, making it the next big chapter in the Legacy of Kain series from Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Interactive. Now, the story of the Legacy of Kain could get very complex, but for the sake of this review, I'll try to keep things as simple as I can. Soul Reaver takes place about 1500 years after the events of Blood Omen, with Kain becoming a ruler of the vampire race and effectively taking over Nosgoth. But the land has gotten much worse since his exploits from earlier, with everything becoming corrupted and decaying due to the corruption of the pillars of Nosgoth. Instead of the game focusing on Kain, however, Soul Reaver is all about Raziel, a vampire who is betrayed and killed by Kain for entering the next stage of evolution for the vampire race. He basically grew bat-like wings. Kain's jealousy caused him to rip Raziel's wings out and throw him into a whirlpool of souls. But instead of Raziel being left to drift in the Lake of the Dead, an ancient elder god resurrects Raziel and turns him into his Soul Reaver, a reaper of souls that carries out the elder god's will. The ancient god then tasks Raziel with killing Kain, enabling him to exact his revenge for the betrayal that he suffered and restore Nosgoth back to its former glory in the process. There's so much more beyond this, but if you can't tell already, the overarching plot is pretty epic and told over multiple games. Soul Reaver is just one part of the greater narrative for the series, but even then it still has a lot of story to take in that becomes important later on. But does that mean that the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver is a fun game to play through now? Like everything else about Nosgoth, there's definitely some good and bad going on here. Now, if you want to talk about great world building and a real good overall handling with how a game takes place in a particular universe, the Legacy of Kain series really does this very well. There's a real reverence to the world of Nosgoth, all the different stuff that has happened years and centuries prior to the game's events of Soul Reaver, and all this other stuff that gets referenced a lot, especially in the dialogue, and the different conversations between characters. It's just something that's awesome in the way that things are described, whether it's Raziel talking about certain areas that he visits, whether it's the Elder God, whether it's Kain, or just, again, any of the voiceovers in Raziel's head. There's a lot of great stuff in here that just, again, has a real reverence and a real weight and a real respect for the world of Nosgoth. Now, don't get me wrong, however, you don't have to play Blood Omen in order to understand some of the things going on with Soul Reaver. It does help as far as understanding the overall story for the Legacy of Kain, and you kind of understand some of the references that certain characters are referring to and when they talk about stuff. However, you can go right into Soul Reaver without knowing anything about the Legacy of Kain and kind of get caught up to speed in some way. Speaking of dialogue and speaking of conversations, let's talk about this voice acting because, man, oh my god, this voice acting is phenomenal. Okay, let me tell you guys, the Legacy of Kain series has some of the best written dialogue and voiceovers in gaming, period. I said this same thing for my review in Blood Omen a while back, and it still holds true here. Amy Hennig is back again writing the story for the series, with Simon Templeman returning as the voice of Kain. Michael Bell joins the series as the voice of Raziel and has a heck of a presence here. These guys are just fantastic with their dialogue, and whenever they interact with each other, they just sound so damn epic. The voiceovers from Raziel as you progress through the game really makes your hair stand up with how foreboding and heavy they sound. And the rest of the voice cast is just as good too with their interactions and monologues. This is the kind of quality you get from fantasy stories like Lord of the Rings that just speak directly into your soul. It seriously almost never gets as good as this for most games when it comes to dialogue and their delivery. Just listen to this and you try to tell me otherwise.
I am your creation, Kain. Now, as before, you criticize your own work. What have you done with my clan, degenerate? You have no right. What I have made, I can also destroy, child.
Damn you, Kain! You are not God! This act of genocide is unconscionable! Conscience? You dare to speak to me of conscience? Only when you have felt the full gravity of choice should you dare question my judgment. Your lifespan is a flicker compared to the mass of doubt and regret that I have borne since Mortanius first turned me from the light.
There really is no better way to put it. The voice acting and the dialogue and the writing for the story and just the conversations in Soul Reaver and the entire Legacy of Kain series, it's some of the best in video game history. I mean, seriously, Simon Templeman and Michael Bell as both Kain and Raziel, their entire dialogue, all their conversations, their bickering, using big like SAT words, just everything that they say just sounds so epic and so important. It just sounds so good when you're listening to it while you're playing the game. Even some of the other actors that they pull from like different British TV shows and movies and stuff, whatever characters that they're voicing, that they're actually showing up in the game and talking about stuff, you want to hear what they have to say. They just make everything just seem super important, whether it's their own ambitions, stuff about the history of Nosgoth or anything that's happening on screen at that moment. You want to listen to them. It's just, again, they just sound so good.
You are reborn. The birth of one of Kain's abominations traps the essence of life. It is this soul that animates the corpse you lived in.
This, at least, had remained constant. The endlessly swirling vortex of the abyss. My tomb and the womb of my rebirth.
But even with all that being said, the voice acting and the presentation of Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver is pretty good. But we also have to talk about gameplay. And to be honest with you guys, this is when the game starts to take a real dip. Soul Reaver is a mixed bag when it comes to its gameplay. I love the dark atmosphere and the world building for its characters and overall narrative, but the execution and actual gameplay is severely lacking in comparison. Like most original PlayStation games of the era, Soul Reaver is a very stiff game to control. The majority of the game is in third person with action and some exploration, but you'll find yourself struggling with the camera frequently as you try to get oriented with what's around you. This becomes a real problem with the game's combat. The hack and slash fighting could be simple and good in some moments, but then become frustrating in others. When you're not wrestling with the camera, you'll have to fight other vampires, zombies, wraiths, and other human warriors occasionally. Killing them isn't as always easy as slashing away. You'll sometimes have to stab them with weapons or throw them into environmental hazards to defeat them. This gets very annoying and can waste your time very early on. Eventually, you'll gain access to the Soul Reaver weapon that lets you deal more damage and kill enemies with a quick finisher, but you can only use it when you have full health. Getting hit once forces you to fight with your hands and puts you at a huge disadvantage. I really disliked this, and found it to be a real pain, especially when it feels like Raziel should always be able to use the Soul Reaver once you get it. They give a reason in the story for why this isn't possible, but that doesn't make it any less troublesome to deal with. The puzzles you have to solve throughout the game are also very annoying. They aren't difficult to solve, but are made difficult with the game's overly dark visuals, stiff movement, and tedious positioning. It could take some time to move boxes around to just the right spot or to activate a specific switch in order to continue progressing through a level. You'll definitely need a guide to figure out some of these puzzles because some of the solutions are just not that easy to spot with the dark polygonal PS1 graphics. This gets much more annoying when enemies appear in the area that aren't easily killed with your attacks. I should also mention that you do get powers and abilities that you can use once you defeat certain bosses. This is a nice touch and could be very cool in some moments, but altogether, I feel that the gameplay of Soul Reaver just hasn't aged all that well. Another thing I should bring up that is a bit of a problem, even though it's a cool idea and premise, is going between the real world and the spectral realm when you're playing as Raziel, trying to figure out some of the different puzzles and just get from place to place. The big issue with this is that not only does the entire game take a really big dip in frame rate, like it sometimes gets really choppy and really messed up because the game is trying to load up all the different changes and stuff between the two realms, but also it could be a real chore when you're trying to figure out puzzles and you realize either you have to go to the spectral realm to get more health or you get knocked into the spectral realm and have to redo a puzzle all over again just because you didn't have enough health to survive some of the enemies coming at you or you ran out of time in the real realm. Like there's a bunch of little annoyances that could become a real pain in the butt when you're trying to just get from point A to point B. This happens also when you're trying to use certain abilities that you can only use in the spectral realm and you can't use in the real world when you're trying to like go through like certain gates or trying to find certain objects and stuff that you can't really interact with in one realm or the other. That could become a real chore and it becomes very tedious, especially in some of the areas that are very dark and very hard to navigate that have a lot more complex puzzles. I should also mention that some of the boss fights could be a little difficult and tedious, especially when you're trying to deal with like the really stiff controls or some of the areas that you can't really navigate too well, even though the majority of the bosses in essence aren't really that hard. There's a couple really good ones, especially with the fights that you have against Kain, which again, all the presentation, the build up to them are really what make those boss fights, but then some of the other monsters that you have to deal with, throughout Nosgoth and throughout the areas you visit, they're not really that hard, but they're just difficult and annoying when you have have to deal with like, super dark areas. You have to kind of go between one realm or the other to deal with certain things, but they're not really bad. They're not really challenging. They're just more annoying than anything else. Outside of all that, however, we do also have to talk about the music of the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, which, again, it's very hit or miss depending on how you look at it. Okay, I'm going to be straight with you all. Soul Reaver doesn't have a great soundtrack. A lot of the music throughout the game sounds very similar, despite there being different themes for each new area that you visit. Much of it consists of background noise in both the real world and the spectral realm, which is cool the first few times, but eventually becomes very bland and forgetful afterwards. Anybody that knows of the Legacy of Kain knows that there's only one standout piece of music that is synonymous with the series. It's called Ozar Mitashim by Kurt Hartland from the band The Information Society. Soul Reaver is the first game we hear this, but since then the track has become one of the defining aspects of the Legacy of Kain series. The music is mostly known as Raziel's theme, it's very memorable and instantly recognizable. The music has been remixed many times after the release of Soul Reaver, with about 20 different variations that you can hear just in this game. Whenever it comes on, the mood gets incredibly tense or everything feels way more epic. The boss fights against Kain are a perfect example of this when you hear it. Once that music hits, you know that stuff is about to go down. Have a quick listen here and you'll see exactly what I mean. The track is literally that good, people. Here's a fun fact for all of you guys. The term Ozar Mitashim is actually a Hebrew term that translates into Treasury of Studies. The term comes from a collection of 200 biblical interpretations from Julius Einstein, which again uses the same name, Ozar Mitashim. The thing is, the song where this music comes from just sounds very good, and for me and many other people is immediately identifiable with the Legacy of Kain series. It just sounds great and it's pretty awesome. However, if I'm being objective here, I wish that there was other pieces of music that were just as good as this particular theme, even though we just got one main theme for this game or this character or this version or this part of the entire series. The rest of the soundtrack for Soul Reaver just doesn't sound that great to me. I think it's very forgettable. I think it's kind of very blah and very basic. It just sounds like background noise for some of the areas that you visit, and I totally get that, and that has a time and place. But if we're going to have such an awesome music track over here, maybe we should get some other music tracks that kind of fit within the same theme or the same type of sound and atmosphere that we got with that really awesome theme. So after everything that I've said up to this point, can I recommend that you guys check out the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver? To be totally honest with all of you, this is really difficult because I love the world of Nosgoth and I love the characters, and I think that the narrative and the story that you follow is pretty awesome, but the gameplay isn't really all that great. It just doesn't feel good to play and really hasn't aged all too well. I highly recommend that if you're interested in the Legacy of Kain as a series, or if you just want to get caught up with what happens in Soul Reaver, you're better off just watching some of the cutscenes and all the different story parts on YouTube or any other place. That way you get caught up and actually find out exactly what's going on without all the frustration of the gameplay. Anyway, there you go, guys. Those are my thoughts about the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. Like I said, I think the story and the characters and the dialogue and the voice acting's awesome, but the gameplay, not so much. But those are just my thoughts about Soul Reaver as a game. Let me know what you guys think about the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver down below in the comments section. Tell me, did you grow up playing this game on the original PlayStation? Do you love the series? What are some of your favorite Legacy of Kain games if you're a Blood Omen or Soul Reaver fan? I mean, which one do you guys like better, Kain or Raziel? I want to see in the comments who stands for who. Which one do you guys really pick? Put all that stuff down below in the comment section and let me know what other games you guys want to see me review here on this channel. Thanks for watching this video, everyone. Make sure you guys check out some of these other videos in the boxes after the credits, and don't forget to visit my Patreon page via the annotations for more exclusive content. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel as well. Peace out, and stay epic, everybody.